Hello and welcome back to another episode of Burning Questions. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing the role of the principal designer, various considerations and concerns around that. And I'm joined today by Tom. Tom, welcome to Burning Questions. Can you introduce yourself, who you are and a bit about your company?
So I'm Tom Hughes. I'm Associate Building Safety Consultant at Sphere. Sphere historically were a CDM consultancy, so they started back in 2012 from a little desk in a little back office giving health and safety advice when the CDM regulations first came out. They've grown into a sort of larger CDM consultancy, and then when the Building Safety Act started to sort of come to light through the Building Safety Bill, there was they sort of saw an opportunity to offer principal designer services for the Building Safety Act work as well. So that service started around about late 2022, early 2023, and has grown from being one director through to a team of about 35 now.
Excellent. Very good. Good growth, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's certainly good and certainly a very necessary role in the construction industry in the current times. So, yeah, to touch on that role of the principal designer, what does it entail and when did it come about exactly, do you think?
The role of the principal designer was established as a part of the Building Safety Act. It was sort of enshrined and really sort of set out by the amendments to the building regulations in 2023 that really sort of properly established the duty holder regime and who the duty holders were and what their duties actually entailed. The principal designer is there to primarily the core duty is to plan, manage, monitor and coordinate the design phase. And so it's a role that involves sort of touching on all the different aspects of the design, and interacting with all the different design parties along with the client as well, and making sure that they're actively engaged in the project to ensure that the design is as close to being as compliant as possible.
We were discussing a little bit before we started recording. There was an element of that prior to 2023 when the Building Safety Act came into force. Was that principal designer role prior to that, or was that more just gearing up for?
Yeah, I guess a lot of it has probably been led by architects as sort of lead designer.
Yeah.
Beforehand, the role of the duty holder role of the principal designer didn't necessarily not in the same way as CDM under the sort of building regulations. That role of the principal designer hadn't actually been sort of enshrined in law at that point yet.
Yeah.
I think maybe some early sort of engagers with the regime maybe sort of saw it come in and started trying to do that. And there's always been an element of the architect being as the lead designer, sort of fulfilling the role to a degree.
Yeah.
And I think the early sort of thought process, I think, behind the duty holder regime was that it was expected that the architect probably would fulfill the principal designer role, and it was aimed sort of in many ways for the architects to fulfill that role. But what we tend to find is that in many cases the architects either they don't want to take it on, either they sort of don't understand it well enough, they don't feel that they've got the sort of relevant competency to do it, or they're just sort of not geared up for it. And so that's where a third party consultant like us can come in. And I think part of that also comes from one of the main duties or one of the main roles of the principal designer as a part of the requirement for competency is to be able to challenge and appraise design work. And I think where particularly in Sphere, a lot of the consultants in our team have come from a building control background.
Yeah.
That deep knowledge of building regulations, procedures and guidance and what compliance actually looks like in a design is something that we have a very good knowledge of. Not necessarily that architects don't have that knowledge, but I think the depth and breadth of the knowledge that we have coming from a building control background, it just takes it that step further. And I think is one of the things that clients and design teams like to have, and have access to in project meetings, that they can sort of lean on us for that advice, and advice that in previous years they would have been able to go to their RBCA as it is now, the building control providers, but that's all been sort of taken away from the RBIs now, and so a lot of that work has now come to us as the principal designer, and that's I think one of the key things that having a separate consultant in the team to provide that advice is really beneficial.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's excellent. I think that probably sort of covers off the next question, which is how is it different from a traditional designer role? But that's really what you're saying, isn't it? Is that it's an extra element.
I mean, pretty much everybody in a project team could be considered a designer as it's defined in the regulations. There is a difference, and something that we sort of end up having some conversations with design teams or with project teams about is a designer who is carrying out design work as it's defined. There's a definition for design work in the regulations as well. So you may be a designer, but you're not necessarily carrying out design work. And so there's an argument to say, well, do you need to prove competency because you're not actually producing design? So your employer's agent could be a designer because they have an influence on the design.
Sure.
But they're not actually carrying out design work in the definition of the regulations, which is sort of drawings, specifications, calculations, etc. And that's sort of where we sit as well, is that as principal designer, we don't necessarily produce design work. We don't draw anything, we don't calculate anything necessarily. It's more a coordination role to make sure that everybody's sort of talking to each other, and that the gaps are identified and sort of joined up, whether that's identifying something that a existing design team member hasn't considered, or it's a need for somebody, a specialist subcontractor to come in and provide that sort of specialist piece of advice or piece of design, and making sure that those gaps are sort of filled. And it's also, as I say, it's that ability to sort of challenge and appraise the claims of compliance, if you like, from the design team members to actually sort of interrogate whether the argument that they're putting forward actually is going to be sort of accepted by the building control body, whether that's building control or the regulator.
Yeah, sure. No, that's very interesting. So I guess it's much wider covering, if that's an expression, but it's not necessarily. So a traditional designer role is potentially someone who is literally doing design, as you said, calculating and drawing design, but it's much wider than that, isn't it?
Yeah, so we again, coming from a building control background, it's we need to have a broad understanding of all the elements of of what goes into a design and what goes into a building. We need to understand architecture, we need to understand some structural engineering, some MEP, and all of those different aspects of the building. You need to have a good understanding of how it works and how it all fits together. Whereas those designers that I've just sort of mentioned, structural engineer, he's an expert in structural engineering.
Sure, yeah.
But you wouldn't expect him to be a fire engineer or an M&E consultant, because that's not where his sort of strengths lie. That's not his competency. Yeah,
sure. No, that's excellent. So how would you say the role of the principal designer has changed the way designers approach projects?
That's a really difficult question in some ways, because I think, as we were saying before we started, that I feel that there's kind of two camps in some ways. The industry can be a little bit divided in. There is very much a part of the industry and designers and project teams that will embrace the role of the principal designer and sort of understand what we're there to do and sort of actively engage with us. And will come to us with queries if they are unsure what compliance might look like for any a certain scenario, or whether we need to sort of bolster or change a design, and that in many ways hasn't changed a lot compared to that's what a lot of designers did anyway with building control in the sort of old regime. There is definitely a camp of designers and clients who don't understand what the principal designer's sort of role is, and how they should engage with us. And that's where the biggest challenge lies, I think, is still it's that element of education. I think the industry is explaining to them, what we're here to do, what benefit we can bring to them. They know that they need a principal designer just because that's what the regulations say. But what we actually do, they still I don't think fully grasp the need and the benefit. And that's I think where the real challenge still lies is sort of providing that level of education, I think, still.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And that would essentially you're there to work with those teams and help them ultimately, and that should be positive change, shouldn't it? It's not something to is a scary thing, or it shouldn't be anyway, should it?
It should be embraced. We're there ultimately to ensure that everybody is, sort of doing what they need to do, and the design ultimately is as good as it can be. And ultimately, we're there to sort of look after the client's interests in many ways. We're one of the the prescribed people that needs to be appointed by the client. The first thing the client needs to do, and under the duty holder regime, is appoint his principal duty holders. And so we're there to identify any risks or any gaps in the design, because at the end of the project, ultimately, it's the client that needs to sign a declaration to say that the design is compliant and they're comfortable with it.
No, that's excellent. I think that probably leads in nicely to the next point, or the next question, as to how the principal designer, so yourselves, work alongside those other teams, the likes of the principal contractor, the client. What does that look like? How do you work with them?
I mean, certainly it's, we are very sort of focused on regular engagement. We try to be, and forge really good relationships with clients and with contractors, because ultimately we're the ones that hold the majority of the sort of responsibility. We have a level of sort of education to ensure that the client really understands what it is that they need to be doing, and the questions that they need to be asking of their appointed designers as well. So I think it's just, it's regular and sort of focused sort of collaboration and meetings with those duty holders to make sure that they really do understand what it is that they need to be doing on their side.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. How do you think the Building Safety Act has influenced the role of designers?
Again, I think it's that two camps thing. I think they say the ones that sort of understand it have embraced it. And I think there's still a long way to go for a lot, sort of a large part of the industry in sort of getting up to speed with what the sort of duty holder regime looks like and sort of how it works in practice. I think one of the difficulties is because it is still relatively new, and there isn't a lot of precedent that's been set by the Building Safety Act. Obviously, we understand what the legislation says, but how that's actually interpreted by the courts and precedent being set, that hasn't been tested in the real world yet, really. And I think that's where a lot of, until we sort of start to go through that process, that's when, we will start to understand a little bit more about, the interpretation, I guess, of the legislation.
Yeah.
And the designers will start to sort of understand where their responsibilities lie and sort of, what that actually might mean for them if something does go wrong as well.
Interesting, yeah. I think the point you mentioned about those two sets of people, I think, would it be fair to say that some people are very much resistant to it, whereas others have embraced it? I think in some cases there's a lot more detail potentially needed in the design than has previously been embraced. What would you say?
The funny thing with sort of construction and the way design works is that a lot of the consultants are providing sort of design intent, and then a lot of the reliance is then brought in on the subcontractors anyway to provide the real detailed design. And so, I think there's an amount of sort of detail that is is still going to be required from the consultants actually to go that little step further to really to set the some very tight parameters I guess within which the subcontractors then need to work, and the understanding I guess of the regime has to sort of come from the top down as well. So the consultants need to understand where their responsibilities lie to then be able to set those parameters for the subcontractors to then work within as well.
100%. Yeah. No, that's very good, because I think that phrase tight parameters is really what it's about, isn't it? Because I think previously in some cases subcontractors have just been given free rein, and that's where potentially problems have started to arise. So
well, it's also we will talk about design liability, is that that's one of the things that has to be very clear about is who is responsible for which elements of the design, and that also feeds into competency as well. Is that we're very clear when we in Safer Sphere will as a part of our service quite often we'll run competency assessments, and so again there can be an element of fear I think sometimes, and it can feel a little bit sort of personal sometimes. You're questioning somebody's competence, but that's it's not an attack. You're not expected to work beyond the areas of your sort of competence. One of the one of the basic cornerstones of competence, I guess, is recognizing where your limit is.
Yeah.
And knowing at the point at which, again, you wouldn't expect a structural engineer to be a fire engineer.
No.
And so, there is a little bit of overlap. And I suppose that's where some of the competency stuff needs to be bolstered, is that where that overlap is. But, that also plays into design liability, in that subcontractors will quite often sort of push back and, are very clear about the extent of their liability and what they're providing. And I guess probably the same goes for the consultants as well, to say, well, we're setting a specification, it's a design intent, it's for the subcontractor to actually really specify the components of the system or whatever it might be. And, I think that's one of the things that we are sort of getting better at in many ways, is understanding where that line needs to be drawn. But that's one of the things that is sort of, it's only really going to come through time spent going through the process.
Yeah, sure. No, liability is certainly very interesting. We'll come back to that one. You did mention there about competency. So obviously, understanding competency is a lot of focus on that in this whole process. In terms of the design role specifically, what sort of skills, behaviours, qualifications, etc., are needed to become a designer?
Yeah, I mean, competency is still a massive challenge, I think, in the industry, and the demonstration of competence, again, within the definition in the legislation and BS 8670. So, I mean, you still expect, again, I'm going to use structural engineers as an example, is that you still expect them to go through, through their degrees and become chartered as you would. But there's an element of the understanding needs to be much broader now. And this goes for all consultants, all designers. Their understanding, particularly of the legislative framework, needs to be much broader. And that's something that I think, I haven't done a structural engineering degree, but I'm going to assume that there isn't a huge amount of focus on the legislation that regulates construction. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But, I think it's so important now, and that, that designers do understand that legislative framework and the parameters that are set, because ultimately, it's your freedom and your life, that's on the line. The responsibility on designers now is written into law. It could land you in prison. That is the ultimate stop point, and that needs to be made really clear. You need to, they need to. It's imperative that they understand just how important it is. And I think that's something that is lacking. The understanding of the legislative framework. We've spent a lot of time trying to understand the legislation, and we're the experts.
Yeah.
And so that's where we have to have that element of education to the industry. And there definitely is. Again, there's two camps of people that understand it and people that that don't. But yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is understanding where you fit into that framework and what it actually means in the real world. And again, we're talking about sort of precedent being set. I think until that starts to happen, and there are cases being taken through the courts, so I think there's certain design practices or people in the industry that it is only at that point at which they will start to take notice.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I guess that it's something you mentioned just previously in terms of competency. I guess there's potentially a bit of hesitance from a lot of people in terms of what you mentioned about understanding the legislation in areas that perhaps one thing you mentioned is where there is that overlap, that knowledge and competency does need to be bolstered, doesn't it? So it's ultimately on those that do need to do the role. There's obviously a necessity for people to do the role, and there's certainly that education and learning needs to take place, doesn't it?
Yeah, and again, I think it's understand, so the understanding the overlap as well. There's a lot of a lot of the responses that we get on these competency assessments that we run is that, particularly around, there's a lot of questions in the criteria for demonstrating competency around understanding fire safety, because of course there is, fire safety is, it's probably the main building safety risk along with structural failure. And so again, all designers are expected to have a degree of fire safety knowledge.
Yeah.
You're not expected to be a fire engineer or to be able to sort of specify a fire alarm system.
Yeah.
But there's still an understanding, or just this broader understanding of fire safety and where you fit in to the picture of any given project is, that's one of the main things I think that needs to be sort of developed in the industry. Taking, like I say, sort of landscape architects, for example, quite often will say, we don't really get involved in fire safety. Well, actually you do, because, if you're sort of specifying things like road widths and pavements and, and access for the fire brigade and, making sure that people can get out and there's level thresholds and all that stuff is actually still a part of fire safety as much as it is, potentially sort of accessibility, requirements is still as much, it all has an impact on fire safety as well, because people ultimately have got to get in and out of the building.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, even for myself, my own knowledge. So ultimately, it's not a case of burying your head in the sand and saying, oh, I'm not doing that, I'm not touching it. It's ultimately on the designer to go out there and improve their knowledge if they're not sure of what they're doing ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you'd say they've got to sort of embrace it, and I think it's very easy to say, I'm not involved in that. It's not really within my sort of skill set, but actually potentially it is, and you need to understand that, and to be able to sort of actively demonstrate competence against it and compliance against it in any given project, because the law says that you are potentially responsible for it, and if something does happen, then you're going to need to you answer that question in front of the judge.
Yeah, no, that's as stark as it could be. Yeah,
absolutely. I don't mean to be a doom monger, but I think that is the ultimate, the sort of ultimate stop point. And there is going to come a time where a case is going to go through the court, and somebody's going to end up having the book thrown at them. I think it's probably an inevitability.
Yeah, no, for sure. How so? As obviously yourselves as consultants, principal designer role, how do you ensure fire safety is a priority at the design stage? You mentioned before that it's one of the most important things along the structural. How is that identified as a priority?
Brought to the forefront. I mean, I think one of the things that we try to do, or certainly I try to do, is forge a relationship with the fire engineer in the early stages of the project. I think that's a really good way of getting the fire engineer on board. And I think, again, it's just sending the message to the design team is that we always, I generally always try and bring the conversation back round to how does it impact fire safety. And say all the different designers will have an influence in some way, generally, whether it's big or small, in fire safety. And I think that's sort of taking this back to what we were saying about, our sort of depth and breadth of understanding of the guidance and legislation from a building control background, is that there may be just very small elements of the design that, one particular designer might touch in terms of fire safety. And so it's only just that sort of little portion of the design that they need to be sort of responsible for.
Yeah.
But it's making sure that is then linked with the fire engineer, and that those two people are talking and understand the design and the impact it has, and just sort of tying all those little threads together and trying to identify the sort of those granular details, I guess.
Yeah, sure. No, that's very interesting. It's collaboration, isn't it, ultimately, in communication?
Yeah, that's what we try to ensure. That's the role of the principal designer, I guess, is to coordinate the design team. And so it's trying to understand where those sort of little nuances in the design may sort of, the little crossovers in sort of very, small areas of the design. I mean, there's obviously, very sort of clear and obvious elements of the design where things like, travel distances and the architect's laying out a general arrangement and things, is that, all of that stuff is obviously going to have an impact on fire safety. But again, speaking about sort of landscape architects and things like level accesses and where the buildings, the entrances and exits sort of discharge to, all those sort of things can quite often, they don't have the same level of sort of consideration, I guess.
But ultimately it has an impact and does need to be considered.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. What would you say to designers that are hesitant to take on this role of principal designer?
I think if you can't demonstrate the competency to be a principal designer, then you probably ought not to do it. I think that's what we've seen is why people come to Safer Sphere or to organisations like us to, because they don't, and there's in a lot of design and build contracts, the contractors quite often are sort of, are either pushed into or, they'll volunteer to be the principal designer, but will then rely on, a third party like Safer Sphere to be their advisor to effectively discharge the duties for them. And so, it is a specialist role.
Yeah.
I think it's not something, if you don't fully understand what's involved in being a principal designer and what the duties are, then you definitely do need some assistance with it. And so, I think it's that level of education, and there's some architecture firms and things that we've worked with that have sort of embraced it and doing it brilliantly. And there's contractors out there as well that are doing it brilliantly as well. But so if you're unsure, I think it's not something to sort of try and you sort of find your way through blindly. You need to sort of call out for help.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And I guess the point is help is available. There are specialists can do that role and can assist. Yeah, that's interesting. Coming back to design liability, we touched on it before. Obviously, very debated topic. Who would you say it falls on? What's the process there?
Everybody.
Yeah,
everybody, and that I think that's entirely the point of the new regime, isn't it? Is that everybody owns a portion of responsibility, be that big or small, and in different areas. But ultimately, in terms of design liability, if it's design work as is defined in the regulations, if you touch it, you own it. If you draw it, you specify it, you calculate it, it is yours to own. So you have to be absolutely sure that that you're sort of demonstrating compliance with it. And again, there is elements of design liability. There's lines to be drawn between sort of specialists and consultants, for example, or even sort of specialist to specialist, where things are aligned, where you might have masonry support going into a facade on a building that's interacting with cavity barriers. There's very tricky lines sometimes to be drawn about how those two components sort of interact with each other. And I know there's some manufacturers and things are doing brilliant work together in collaboration with with other manufacturers to make sure that those sort of systems will work together. But there's still a line to be drawn around who is responsible for which element. But ultimately, as the principal designer, we need to make sure that we have a sort of a cohesive argument from everybody to that the whole building as a system, as a whole, is actually achieving compliance, and that we can demonstrate that.
Yeah, sure. So it doesn't necessarily fall on the principal designer then?
Not necessarily, no. So obviously a designer owns their design. They're responsible for their own design. The principal designer is there to sort of plan, monitor and coordinate. So they want to make sure that it's not the principal designer's role or duty to ensure compliance. It is ultimately the designers that hold responsibility for that. The principal designer is there to make sure that the design is coordinated as best as it can be, to make sure that the products interact in the right way, for example, and they will work together. But ultimately, it's the designers that own the design responsibility for it.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you very much for joining us, Tom. Before we finish, any final words?
I think if anybody's got any projects that they need help with or need any regulatory advice, Safer Sphere are here to help. So give us a call. We're more than happy to sort of guide you through the new regime as best as we can.
It's brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's certainly been very interesting for me, and I'm sure it will be for those that watch the episode. Make sure you're subscribed and following us on social media for any more updates on fire safety and general construction knowledge as well. We're here to educate and support. So thank you for watching, and please keep in touch.